So at this point, anyone who would like to ask a question to any and all of the speakers should line up behind the microphone. And can we have your name, please?
Hi, I'm Evelyn Ginsburg. This is a basic genetic question. If we share 99 point something % of our genes with chimpanzees, but my distant cousins on 23andMe share 2%, is this a different counting system? How are we counting what percentage of genes match?
Who's going to answer that?
I can try to speak to that since I brought up the factoid. So 99.9% of your DNA is the same as, say, your neighbors or somebody across the planet. That said, that fraction that varies tells us a lot about inheritance. So if you're looking between you versus one of your parents, you will share 50% of the variable sites in your DNA with your parents. And then if you start to look back further and further in time, say look at your grandparents, you'll share on average about a quarter of your variable sites in your DNA with your grandparents. So it's a difference between what's varying generally in the population versus what varies across enormous timescales.
So it's the variation between different humans, assuming that you found all the variation that there is?
Yeah, that's right. And this is due to like common variation, not these super, super rare individual specific variants that are arising very newly within the population.
So it's some small subset of all possible genes that you're measuring when you say we have 2% in common with Neanderthals?
Do you want to answer the Neanderthal part?
Yeah, so that refers to what fraction of your genetic ancestry traces itself to the Neanderthals. So the 2% number says, essentially you can think of every point in your genome, you can trace its ancestors. And so you have many such genetic ancestors. And of those set of genetic ancestors, about 2% will trace their ancestry to the Neanderthal lineage. So that's really what we mean when we talk about 2% Neanderthal ancestry.
I'm not sure I understand. 2% of the entire genome counting every single DNA pair?
So it's the ancestry along of your genome. So, for example, when you're looking at parents, right? So that is genetic ancestry that's immediate. But then when you go to the next generation, you have your grandparents. So there are 4 possible ancestors, and they can contribute different amounts of genetic material to different parts of your genome.
Oh, so it's 2% of the tree?
So the way to think about it is if you take one point in your genome and you go to your parent, so you inherit it from one of your parents, and then you follow which parent that parent inherited it from, and you keep going all the way back, right? So you will, at some point, maybe 50,000 years back, you will either go to the Neanderthal or you will go to the modern human, right? So this is for one point in your genome. Now you go to another point and you repeat this process and see which ancestor that part of the genome traces its ancestry to. In general, they need not be the same, and this is because of recombination. So keep switching around as you move along the genome.
Okay.
And yeah, so that's where then you count it up and you ask what percentage comes from Neanderthals. On average, it's about 2%.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hi. My question is for Alicia Martin. And in this problem, right, that we have, it's not a new problem. I think of it as sampling error, where the data that we collect and the conclusions that we draw from it in medicine have been around for a really long time. So this seems to me to be an extension of a very, very old problem. And the fact that we draw conclusions in ways which somehow don't really take into account what the actual sample is. Do you have any thoughts on how we can go about correcting this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. Yeah, so to your point, this problem has been around for a long time. It's been around as long as genetics, or even far before genetics was being studied regularly across populations. So like a decade ago, for example, researchers said that 96% of participants in genetic studies were of European descent. Now we're at 80%, so we're making some progress, but of course it's not fast enough. And so I think the ways that we need to start enabling some parity in these public health issues that are going to start emerging with the translation of genetic technologies is by enabling funding sources to start to, focus more outside of European populations than within European populations. I think we're also going to need to encourage more genetic investment of resources outside of Europe and the US. Local researchers are going to need to take this up at scale within different continents as well. I think this is going to need to happen on a very large scale globally. But it's also important to note that we're not reflecting the diversity that's present in the US. So the US is also going to need to step up and make sure that the data access for some very large diverse cohorts that already exist are accessible to a globally diverse community. So there are some very large cohorts that are out there that capture the breadth of diversity in the US, where it's actually really hard to access genetic summary statistics. And this isn't due to any privacy concerns, because genetic summary data is exactly that. It's summary data. There's no individual level privacy concerns for that type of data. So we also need to make sure that we can access that. So there's like many different moving parts that all need to coalesce, I think, to move towards parity. And it's going to be a very hard problem that we need to start really making concerted efforts to try to address over the coming many years.
Sure.
Just one quick follow-up, and that is, do you think it would help to diversify the professional community of researchers doing the work?
Yeah. It feels a little ironic talking to some of my more diverse colleagues who are studying European participants at scale as sort of the white girl up here harping on the fact that we need more diverse participants in genetic studies. Of course, that's the case. And I think we certainly need to diversify the academic community. But we also need to encourage new leaders that are invested in this problem as sort of something that they're going to be driving forward longer term. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Nick?
I'm Nick Patterson. I used to be at Broad, and I'm at Harvard Evolutionary Biology and Harvard Medical School. And I just wanted to share with you something I talked about with Alyssa, how there can be how some of the minority communities in this country have not been treated well, and there's a second-order effect on whether they participate in studies. So I just will share with you, I was involved in a medical study of cardiovascular genetics in African Americans. And the primary center of the study was in Mississippi. And we had a poorer response than we wanted from the African American community. And a common question we were asked is, if we give you our genetic data, will that be available to law enforcement? And the legal answer is, under subpoena, absolutely yes. And it's hardly a secret that the African American community in the Deep South and law enforcement have not always got on very well. So the consequence was that our participation was lower than we wanted. And so that's a political problem due to past political and present political effects in the United States. And it's causing technical difficulties in acquiring the data that Alicia wants to see. So I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, Nick, that's an excellent point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that, absolutely the mistrust that happens in academic research is often earned through historical misuse of data or through historical tensions with law enforcement. Like, that's absolutely the case. And I think to start to broach some of these issues, we need to be very delicate about how we start to communicate both the needs for public health purposes versus the tensions with law enforcement or with other bodies.
Yes, Alyssa?
Hi. So I have my freshman seminar students here today, and they're taking a freshman seminar about prediction. And some people here know I have a particular interest in prediction. And my long-term dream is that data science will help us with climate change. And so what does this have to do with you? The question is, I know that in academia, there are a lot of silos, and a lot of what you are doing is obviously related to what each other are doing here, right? And what I want to know is, let's say we're thinking about a future where we're going to have the ability to really simulate the future of the Earth. And we need to understand the interaction of all four things that you were talking about, and how is the climate forcing that, and how are, the fact that people are eating tilapia and ones with Neanderthal DNA are, and without Neanderthal, then they're having, clover honey on it and whatever else they're doing. So what venues are there for you to exchange your data and your ideas, other than today, which is wonderful, but in other words, are there organizations where people are thinking about kind of pooling the kind of data and research that you all have across your sub-disciplines that all touch on evolution? Anybody can answer.
Anybody answer that?
I mean, I don't know about the others, but I'm a strong proponent of open science. I put all of my data sets, all of my code, drafts of my manuscript, like everything's just available online even before publication, which might be a pretty extreme route, but I believe in just having it out there for other people to use and see. Now I know that's not always the case, especially if you're dealing in human genetics and you have samples that maybe would violate some sort of law, and you can't just put it out on the internet for everybody to have access to, but at least nobody cares about clover to that extent. So I'm happy to put all of my data and my code online, and it's often helpful for other people too who are doing similar things. And so at least in my case, I just try to be open as possible as I can with the stuff that I am doing and want to do, and then hopefully that sort of fosters that sort of open science type of idea that you're talking about.
And that, if I may, and that is the problem right there. A big portion of the problem is that the white clover, who really cares? But the implications for humans, and of course, tilapia aside, is that we are restricted by putting human data or identifier. Everything is de-identified, and it's not, from my experience, it's not so much that the participants are worried about what they put online. It's really because of the health insurance discrimination. There's other, we have to go deep to, it's going to be more than the 2 minutes that are left in this session, to uncover why we can't have open access. It's not, my experience is not because that there's not a willingness to be transparent and forthcoming by the participants, but they're hindered by forces beyond themselves. So I'm going to open it up to the rest. I didn't mean to get on my soapbox, but go on. Anybody else? Yes, Katie.
Just one other note. I think that idea requires us to really think outside the box. And it's not only data accessibility, it's thinking about how we cross disciplinary boundaries to make those kinds of connections. And I think that's a persistent societal challenge. I don't think that there's an organization that does that, but it requires individual thinkers to be willing to take those leaps.
Yes, there are a few questions.
Hi. Okay, I have a couple questions. Number one, in your talk, you mentioned that there's 2% Neanderthal DNA on average in a person. And I noticed in that graph where you had the percent of, or the figure where you had the amount of introgression in, I think East Asians and some other populations, the peaks were not overlapping. So I'm just curious, what's the total coverage of Neanderthal peaks across everyone? So if I have I don't have 2%, but if someone else has 2% and someone else has 2%, that might be 3% total coverage. Are they very overlapping or just completely everywhere?
Yeah, so we tried to do this experiment where we said, let's say we took all of the segments of Neanderthal DNA across all the people that we can identify. Can we stitch them together? And if we do that, how much of the Neanderthal do we actually recover from present-day people? And so we recovered of the order of around 60% of the genome. Yeah, so 60. So in terms of lengths. So what that's telling you is at least one person has a chunk of Neanderthal DNA that you can use to stitch together a full kind of genome. And now you can ask, I mean, there's another question you can ask, maybe how much further can we get? Can we, if we had a bigger sample size, can we get closer? And I think that's where you run into these issues of these deserts, which nobody seems to have Neanderthal DNA at. And so I think we're kind of saturating literally how much of the genome we can cover that way.
Okay, well, that's already surprising. Like, I thought it would be like, 8%. Is that a published analysis, or is that just like some experiment?
It's published in our 2014 paper.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
All right, second question, because I was confused. You had this argument of like constraints to justify. I completely forgot. I just want you to like sort of re-explain how constraint on evolution helps you make arguments for introgression events. Sort of re-explain.
So I'm assuming you're talking about what happens in regions of the genome that are constrained and how much Neanderthal DNA is present in those regions.
Yeah. You just had like some graphs that's like constraints on like the x-axis. Like I just didn't understand that.
Yeah, so there are some regions of the genome. For example, if you go close to genes, which are functional elements in the genome, there tends to be more constraint. So what that means is...
I know what that means. I'm just saying, like, how does that play into the introgression?
Okay, so those are places where there is going to be stronger selection on mutations that are deleterious. So for example, if you have a Neanderthal chunk and it carries a deleterious mutation, depending on which part of the genome you're looking at, whether it's a more constrained or a less constrained genome, the selection is going to be stronger in one versus the other. And so in the first case, it gets removed quickly.
I see.
And so you're going to see a reduction compared to the second case.
Okay, cool. And then, sorry, one more question for Alicia.
Can you save your question for the reception? We'll have a reception downstairs right after, and then you can corner Sriram and ask all the questions you want.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
If your question is quick.
Yeah, really quick. My name's Christina Wilson, and I'm thrilled by the advances in research that you all are doing, but I also wonder what you personally feel like your obligations are in a country like America where, for instance, healthcare is not a guaranteed, access to healthcare isn't a guaranteed right, and what the implications of essentially marking everyone's pre-existing conditions from birth, I think you said, has on sort of the socio-political economic conditions that may or may not be exacerbated. So one thing to the organizers, I would have loved to see a bioethicist or a...
We talked about that. Sean, didn't you say during the break that, yes, we've already
Oh,
taken
great.
that?
So that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
But also, like, personally, I mean, we already heard from James that his philosophy is put it all out there, and you're dealing with the white clover. But this happens in cities, too, with open data in cities about, technological points of contact and similar things. You have, like, corporations and for-profit industries using this public data to do what they will with. So I'm just wondering as scientists, what your personal sense of obligation is to protecting sort of the rest of us living and being thrilled by the discoveries, but wanting to live a good life.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a pretty big question, so I think maybe we can start to tag team pieces of this. So in thinking about like how genetics can mark you from birth for some traits or not, I want to reemphasize the fact that genetics is not deterministic, especially for complex traits that we're studying like cardiovascular disease. Of course, your environmental effects can be as big or more important than some of your genetic factors. So I think it's, of course, an important issue to make sure that the non-discrimination acts in genetics continue to be upheld. We need to make sure that that does not go away at any point in time. I think we need to advocate to policymakers that this is really important as it stays separate from health insurance companies. Like all of those factors are really important. And then to the open science, sense of camaraderie that we all share. Like, I would emphasize that in human genetics, while it's hard to share individual level data, we are also interested in sharing summary data that can be used for anybody that's out there to like compute their own scores or start to learn about their own biology. So that's certainly also out there and accessible through a lot of these public servers. And we also put all of our code out there, and we also put all of our manuscripts on preprint servers so that anyone can access them as soon as we're in a state to actually share them. Does anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, so I'm also part of the same community, and so again, I think it's extremely useful to have access to data. So in human genetics, a lot of the genotypes, including the Neanderthal DNA, that's publicly available. You can access them, you can search for them, you can write your own tools to query your DNA. Harder when you overlay it with trait data of different kinds, but that's where the community has agreed to do sharing of summary statistics, and that's been a way of still sharing data without getting into these privacy issues, and I think that's been extremely valuable.
But again, sorry, just to follow up, but you're talking about, and you did in your talk too, Alicia, which is great, talking about the bottom-up effect of us taking that knowledge that we now know about, our personal genome by doing a 23andMe or whatever, and making changes in our lifestyle. But what I'm talking about is the top-down, and somebody being able at a policy level or a corporate level to take that data and apply it to mass population. So those seem like very different, those have very different flavors and implications, I think.
Okay, well, that is great for reception discussion. I would like to thank wholeheartedly these 4 fantastic rock stars. Sriram, Alicia, Katie, and James. Thank you. I am very optimistic. The future is very bright because these are early career scientists that will inform us for many, many years to come. Years that Alyssa and I will no longer be here. No. Didn't you take your 23andMe? No, I'm kidding. Okay, with that, the reception is on the first floor. Thank you.